This video is not fiction. All facts are historical and are based on the master's thesis of Heikki Hesso, who studied the religious roots of Europe at the Faculty of Theology of the University of Helsinki in 2014. The author did a mind-blowing job of researching and analyzing the ancient texts that I'm going to talk about. So all the credit goes to the author, not to me. I'm just here to share those unbelievable findings with you in a more accessible and engaging way. I hope you enjoy these video series and learn something new about Eve and her story. Let's get started. In this video, we are going to explore 3 fascinating facts about Eve, the first woman in the Bible, and how she was portrayed in different texts from ancient times. First part, how Eve became the scapegoat of paradise. Second part, how Eve was blamed or praised by different writers. And in the third part, we will look how Eve shaped the perception of women and sin. But before I dive into the hidden secrets of the Nag Hammadi texts, which reveal a different side of Eve, I want to give you a quick overview of how Eve was seen in both Jewish and Christian tradition. I will focus on some texts that retell the events of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, where we find the original story of Eve. Of course, there is a lot more to say about Eve in early Jewish and Christian literature, but I will only highlight some key facts that will help us understand the cultural background and attitude toward Eve. After all, if we want to appreciate how Eve's character has evolved over time, we need to start from the beginning. So let's go back to Genesis and see what it says about Eve. The story of Genesis is simple. After creating the world, God creates human beings. There are 2 versions of this story. One that says God created humans, male and female, at the same time, and another that says God created Eve from Adam's rib. The second version introduces the serpent, a cunning creature that talks to Eve and convinces her to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This act of disobedience changes everything. Humans realize they are naked and feel ashamed. They hide from God, and they are banished from paradise. After leaving paradise, Eve gives birth to 3 sons with Adam: Cain, Abel, and Seth. Cain kills Abel out of jealousy, and Seth becomes the ancestor of humanity. Now, there are 2 important things to notice here. First, the text does not call the serpent the devil or Satan, as later tradition does. And second, the text does not use the word fall to describe what happened to humans. These are later interpretations that shaped how people understood the story. The story itself is very old and has many layers of meaning. One of the most famous texts that retells the story of paradise is called Life of Adam and Eve, or Apocalypse of Moses. It was written around the 1st century CE, and it focuses on Adam, Seth, and Eve. It has some amazing details about paradise, but it also has a very negative view of Eve. Eve blames herself for everything that went wrong and says that she was tricked by the devil who disguised himself as a serpent. She does extreme penance for her sin. In this text, Eve is clearly the guilty one who caused all the trouble for humanity. The serpent is no longer just a clever animal, but a powerful enemy of God. This is just one example of how Eve's story was interpreted in different ways by different people. One of the oldest texts that retells the story of Eve is the Book of Jubilees, which was written around the 2nd century BC. This text leaves out some parts of the original Genesis story, such as God's questioning of Adam, and focuses on Eve and the serpent. The text also emphasizes the curse that God put on Eve, while downplaying the curse on Adam and the serpent. The text does not identify the serpent with the devil, but it does mention demons later on. The text seems to have a negative view of Eve and her role in the transgression. The story of Eve also had a huge impact on the development of Christian theology. One of the most influential thinkers was Augustine, who came up with the idea of original sin, which means that all humans are born sinful because of what Adam and Eve did in paradise. But even before Augustine, there were other Christian writers who used the story of Eve to make their points. Tertullian had a very harsh view of women and called them the gateway of the devil, linking them to Eve and her actions in paradise. Augustine also had a negative view of women and said that every woman has a bit of Eve in her, which men should be careful of. He also linked women to Eve and the fall. In Jewish interpretations, women had a more complex role. On one hand, women were respected and valued as the missing part of man, which shows that they were essential for human creation. Without woman, man would have been incomplete. On the other hand, Some interpretations associated women with sexual lust and sinfulness, which they traced back to Eve's action in paradise or to her nature. This was also connected to another mythical figure, Lilith, who was supposed to be Adam's first wife before Eve. Lilith was a strong, independent, and sexually powerful demoness who rebelled against Adam and God. These are just some examples of how different writers used the story of Eve to express their views on women and society. Now let's move to the third part: how Eve shaped the perception of women and sin. I have given you a quick overview of how Eve was portrayed in different texts from ancient times. First, how Genesis and its first chapters influenced the way people thought about women and their role in society. Some texts interpreted Genesis in a way that blamed Eve for the transgression in paradise, because she was the one who talked to the serpent and ate the fruit. Some texts also used this to justify women's lower status and to make them responsible for all the evil and suffering in the world. They ignored the fact that Adam was also involved and punished by God. They made Eve the scapegoat of paradise and extended this to all women in Jewish and Christian cultures. Second, how the tradition about the serpent as the devil emerged and became attached to the story of Eve. Some texts identified the serpent with the devil or his agent and made him a powerful enemy of God and humans. The story was no longer just an explanation of how things came to be, but also a story of how sin and evil entered the world through Eve's deception by the devil. In Christianity, Eve's role in the origin of sin was emphasized and contrasted with Mary's role as the mother of Christ, who was seen as the new Eve who reversed Eve's mistake. This does not mean that all early Jewish and Christian texts were against women or hated them, such as the Gospel of Mary portrays Mary Magdalene as a prominent disciple and leader of the early church. The Gospel of Philip depicts Mary Magdalene as Jesus' companion and partner. The Proto-Gospel of James narrates the birth and childhood of Mary, the mother of Jesus. The Gospel of Thomas contains sayings attributed to Jesus that emphasize the equality and dignity of women. However, none of these Gospels was included in the Bible by the Church Fathers. Perhaps you have your own opinions about their reasons. But it does mean that sexuality, sin, and the fall were central themes in the way people understood women and their nature in many early Jewish and Christian texts. In the Nag Hammadi texts, we can find different traditions. The authors of the texts use Genesis, Middle Platonic philosophy, and rabbinical material as their sources, to name a few. What is the purpose of the use of these traditions? What happens to the character of Eve when it comes to the Nag Hammadi texts? If you are curious to know more, please leave some comments below and stay tuned for the next part of this video series. You can find it here on the screen when it is ready. Thank you for watching and see you soon.